and I had an oil leak, and the oil was spraying on the 1500-degree exhaust, lost oil pressure, and basically lost power. The prop overspun, and I was 19.6 nautical miles from the nearest airport, and I needed to decide whether I would ditch in the Strait of Malacca or take a chance and fly to Kuala Lumpur International 2. And the problem with that was you had to fly over the dense jungle, which is the absolute worst case scenario. And then what are you going to deal with when you're flying into an international airport that's landing planes every few minutes?
That's Robert DeLaurentis talking about one of the 6 close calls he had on his first trip around the world in a single-engine aircraft. And in a moment, we'll be talking with him about that trip, as well as his upcoming polar circumnavigation, as well as his books. Hello again, and welcome to Aviation News Talk, a weekly show with relevant news and flying tips for pilots and student pilots to help keep you safe. I'm Max Trescott. By the way, if you have thought about maybe someday buying a Cirrus SR20, SR22, or SF50 Vision jet, or you'd like to get flight training in one, just give me a call. There's a lot I can do to help you with. I'm here at 650-967-2500. It's a free consultation and possibly a free demo flight. Now, last week in episode 118, we answered listener questions about instrument flying in IFR. So if you missed that episode, you may want to check it out. And if you have found value in any of our shows, well, please consider supporting us with just a small donation through the Patreon page at aviationnewstalk.com/awesome. Or if you have a PayPal account, really easy to make a one-time or monthly contribution through PayPal at aviationnewstalk.com/PayPal. And when you do, we'll read your name on the show. Now here's our conversation with Robert DeLaurentis. Now let me tell you a little bit about Robert. Robert served as an officer in the U.S. Navy and attained the rank of lieutenant commander. Following his Navy career, he founded a real estate development company that focused on projects in the San Diego, California area where he currently lives. In 2009, he finally had the time and resources to get his private pilot license, and in 2015, he flew solo around the world in a single-engine Piper Malibu Mirage he dubbed the Spirit of San Diego. He's the author of 2 books, Flying Through Life and Zen Pilot, Flight of Passion and the Journey Within, and he's currently planning a polar circumnavigation in his new plane, which is what we'll be talking about today. Robert, welcome to the show. We're happy to have you here.
Thanks, Max. It's great to be on your show. You know, I've been a big fan of yours for many years, so to finally get to chat with you like this is awesome.
So I want to get to your current circumnavigation in a few minutes, but let's go back and talk about your first trip around the world. What were your objectives on that trip, and what were you trying to accomplish?
You know, I had written that first book, Flying Through Life, which was about incorporating spiritual concepts in business. There was 19 of them. And that book, those lessons, the series of years that it took to create that tripled the size of my business. And it created the resources of time and money. And I wanted to share those tips with the world so that people like pilots could fly more. And rather than just talk about it, I wanted to show the world what was possible. So we were trying to come up with something that fit into alignment with the book, which talked a lot about the impossibly big dream. So for me, taking a single engine piston plane around the world was one of my impossibly big dreams. And it seemed like the perfect opportunity to meld my passions of business and flying and spirituality as well.
Well, I think every pilot out there would like to be able to fly more. So I think that's, a great dream to have. And yet most people wouldn't think about going around the world in terms of flying more. What about that attracted you to doing that rather than just flying more around the country?
You know, I had read an article in AOPA Pilot a number of years before. There was a guy named Bob Gannon, and he had flown, I believe it was a 182 around the world. And I remember reading that article, and I don't think you could have pulled the magazine away from me. I was just so intrigued by that. You know, the thought of flying a general aviation plane, one outside the United States, but then going to all these different countries just seemed like the most fantastic use of a general aviation plane possible.
Most people never get the chance to fly around the world. What were some of the things when you look back and say, wow, I never would have been able to see or experience this if I hadn't flown around the world?
I think at the time when I started out, Max, I had this perception of how big my world was. And to be able to hop in a general aviation aircraft and fly to another country is something that sort of opens you up. And I had done a lot of traveling back in the day. So some of these countries I had been to before, but there's something unique and special about flying yourself outside of the United States to another country. It made it a better experience. I had just an entirely different experience going into those countries using my plane. And I have to say that at the end of the trip, when I came back to the United States, I was never more proud of something that I had done than that trip. And it was just a wonderful feeling. It opened me up to the world, really.
Hmm. So I would imagine you had a lot of quiet moments by yourself there as you're flying across long distances. Any kind of aha moments or insights that you drew from, those times when you were flying solo?
Yeah, many moments like that. And there are a lot of them are documented in the book Zen Pilot as Zen moments. But there was one in particular. I was flying actually with another person. I know you asked me to answer the question by myself, but she was just sitting quietly in the right seat of the plane. And I sort of felt like I was phasing out of reality, almost like I was in my dream life. And I thought to myself, when your life is such a close reflection of what you've always dreamed of doing, then sometimes the dream becomes more real than reality. And there are people, Deepak Chopra says that often, that sometimes the dream is more real than, the life you're experiencing. So I just had a series of moments like that. In the silence is meditation. And there are people that say when there is silence, there is meditation. So 120 hours of meditation, that'll take you places you never thought you'd go, quite honestly.
Well, and what a better place to be doing it than in an airplane. You talked about reflecting back and all the great things about the trip. I can imagine, though, that in the moment there were times when it was actually quite terrifying. I mean, what was the reality of like flying around the world versus what you had imagined it would be like beforehand?
Well, when I got into my plane leaving San Diego, I had this knot in my stomach and I knew something big was going to be happening on this trip. I didn't realize there would be so many big things. Probably the most terrifying part of the trip was 14,000 feet over the Strait of Malacca. And I was overloaded with 600 pounds of avgas, highly flammable avgas inside a plane that was designed to fly at a much lighter weight. And I had an oil leak, and the oil was spraying on the 1500-degree exhaust, lost oil pressure, and basically lost power. The prop overspun, and I was 19.6 nautical miles from the nearest airport. And I needed to decide whether I would ditch in the Strait of Malacca or take a chance and fly to Kuala Lumpur International 2. And the problem with that was you had to fly over the dense jungle, which is the absolute worst case scenario. And then what are you going to deal with when you're flying into an international airport that's landing planes every few minutes? And that was like you just joined a club you don't want to be a part of, and you have no option but to play in that game. And that was a defining moment in my life. I ended up doing a lot of lecturing on that and writing about that moment. But I don't know, have you ever been in a game that you didn't want to play, but you had no choice?
Oh, yes, I'm sure we've all had those kind of moments, and all you can do is just kind of hang on and go along for the ride. Now, you talked about that in the book, and one of the things that was a struggle there, which you wouldn't imagine would be a struggle, was just dealing with ATC, and yet I think that's a common experience that all pilots have. Why don't you tell us a little bit about dealing with ATC and what pilots need to do when they're in these kinds of situations when they're not getting what they need?
That's a great question. In the United States, I think few pilots have ever said no to the air traffic controller or cannot comply. But, we have to keep in mind that they're not in the plane with us. They don't have the perspective or the altitude to see what's going on. And some of them aren't pilots. Now, don't get me wrong. I think the service they provide is amazing. And without them, air traffic or air travel would not be nearly as safe. But I had situations where I had weather. I had situations where I just couldn't make it back to a different airport that they had recommended I fly back to. I didn't have the altitude. So I basically told them it was my last communication, that I was headed direct Kuala Lumpur and to make some space for me. And they ended up clearing 6 flights that were landing. So it was a very dramatic moment, but, of course, I'll let people read the book and see how it ended up. But very important to have the support of the air traffic controllers, but also very important to be strong enough to stand up to them when they make a request that doesn't work.
Yeah, I often tell pilots that if it were not for pilots, the job of air traffic controller would not exist and that they work for us. But I think pilots hear that voice as the voice of God and that they have to obey what they're being told.
Yeah, absolutely. And I ask the question sometimes of experienced pilots, how many times do you think your life might have been put at risk if you had followed instructions you were given? And for me, the number is like 2 or 3. And, ultimately you are the pilot in command. And I think we need to remind ourselves of that.
Yep, it's a huge responsibility that we can't give up. Now, let me ask you a little bit about fear in the cockpit. You wrote in Zen Pilot that you weren't alone, but that fear was your companion. Tell us about that, and what did you learn about how to combat fear?
That's a great question, Max. I actually did a DVD on overcoming the fear of flying, unleashing potential with Gleim Aviation. And I actually also lectured on that topic for AOPA for about a year. And I never wanted to be the expert on fear. It was just something that I referred to it as my constant companion on that trip. But, I think to stay safe and to stay alive, a little bit of fear is not a bad thing for a pilot. It keeps us double checking things, inspecting the plane, anticipating things that might come up, and being better pilots, quite honestly. At the point where someone doesn't have fear, I think that's the point I would be most concerned. But, in that DVD, I talk about many ways to overcome your fear. And it's not just in a plane. It could be other fear that you take with you everywhere you go, right? Because it's not like you unload it and then pick it up again. It's on your shoulders every day of your life until you free yourself from it. And one of the things that I found in preparing for my trip was that people were triggered. So I told my family and friends, hey, I'm going to do this flight around the world. And what happened was all their fears came to the surface. So, for example, my dad said, hey, why don't you skip the flight, get a country club membership, and not put your life at risk? And my girlfriend said, hey, I had a dream that you died a terrible death alone in the Pacific. And my best buddy said, why don't you wait till you can afford a turbine and improve your chances? But what I came to realize was that those were their fears, not mine. And all I could do was address the fears that I have. And my fears, there was about 5 of them. It had to do with doing a nighttime instrument approach into an island with weather, turbulence, non-towered, when I was fatigued. And I practiced for that moment. I found that the Tahoe Truckee Airport, one of my sponsors, was the ideal place to try that. Now, it wasn't surrounded by water, but there was Lake Tahoe close by, mountains, nighttime, tower closed, turbulence, instrument approach. And I nailed that approach. And I thought, wow, I did it. I'm ready. But what I didn't realize is that the universe would test me several times. It's not enough just to do it once. So that was something that was always looming.
Yeah, I think there's probably a continuum of fear, in terms of people being just kind of a little bit anxious, for example, before a particular landing, to being, flat out scared to death in a particular, situation. And I'm imagining that, to some extent on the low end of the spectrum, that's just kind of paranoia, right? The positive power of paranoia, as someone else once said to me. How did that kind of fit in with your planning? You said the planning was the most difficult part. I mean, wasn't part of that just kind of be paranoid that something could go wrong?
Well, I think part of what you're mentioning, Max, is what I call the voices of self-doubt. And I think those are the primitive voices that live in our head that try and protect us. I mean, they're there for our good. So the voices sort of steer you away from some of those issues. But on the flip side of that, you've got to remind yourself that the story you're telling, you're probably going to believe. So you might as well make it a good one. So I like to remind myself, I've been flying for 8-9 years now. I have about 2,000 hours. I've done some instrument approaches into some really challenging places. I've never had an accident or an incident, knock on wood. And I've done a lot of things right. And I realize maybe the most important lesson is that we're only as good as the flight we're on. doesn't truly matter how many past successes you are. You've got to stay focused in the moment. And yes, you can draw upon that past experience, but you've got to be present. You've got to be present for what you're doing.
Yeah, I've often said that as pilots, we're only good as our last decision. Doesn't matter how great you are and how many things you've accomplished in the past. All it takes is one wrong decision and things can go south.
Yeah, and it's funny because I don't think pilots talk about many of their mistakes. I make a reference to a cell phone, right? Our cell phones cost close to $1,000, and you would never intentionally drop a cell phone, but we've all done it, right? And it's the same thing in a plane. We would never intentionally want to make a mistake in a plane, but they happen. And just constantly knowing that you're on that edge, you've got to be in the moment, a very spiritual concept, right? It's being present in the now. So there's a lot of references to spiritual growth in my books because I think they're connected.
Yeah, I think that's one of the nice things about flying is that you are in the moment and suddenly all of your cares and fears and worries about life are kind of behind you. I think that's just nice. You can go to the airport and suddenly all your worries are behind you when you're up in the airplane because you're just, focused on flying.
Yeah, it's a beautiful thing. And I think for me, it's the most connected I feel in my life, quite honestly. It's one of the more spiritual things a person can do. And I don't know that your average pilot's thinking, wow, I'm having a spiritual experience, but I definitely believe it's happening every time.
So you wrote in Zen Pilot that as you were about to take off from Hawaii for the longest leg of the trip, quote, I thought I don't need to do this more than once in my life. Now, here you are, you're planning a second world trip. Tell me what's changed from that moment when you were about to take off from Hawaii, and why are you now doing a second trip?
That first trip was very focused on aviation, safety, and technology. And what we came to realize was that the plane was just an amazing global billboard for any causes that we chose to support. And it happens so infrequently that somebody flies pole to pole in a plane, like this upcoming trip, that it just made sense to maybe go at it a little bit bigger. And like I said, from flying through life, the impossibly big dream was worth pursuing. So, as my trip's been delayed now 3 times, originally I thought it was going to take 6 months to prepare for like the equatorial circumnavigation I did in 2015 in the Spirit of San Diego. This new flight in the Citizen of the World, I think we're at about 24 months in terms of preparation time. And every time we delay it, something bigger seems to happen for the trip. So I like to think that I'm being guided and the universe sort of has my back in this one. So as it's delayed, I get to practice some patience, which I'm not very good at. But I realize then that the phone will ring or I'll make that connection that will open this trip up to millions of people.
Well, let's talk about what's going to be different about this particular trip. Describe for people just what a polar circumnavigation is as opposed to the trip you previously did.
Yeah, it's a totally different animal. And some people don't understand why, but there's a number of reasons why. One is the vast distances that are required to make it to the South Pole. I think on my first trip, Honolulu to Monterey was about 2,300 nautical miles. We're looking at 4,250 nautical miles to make that one leg to the South Pole. And keep in mind that these planes are not designed for that. So the modifications that you make, adding fuel tanks, in my case, putting improved engines on, custom 5-bladed nickel-tip scimitar composite props, upgrading the plane to RVSM so they can fly at 35,000 feet, putting a ceramic coating on it to make it more slippery, changing out avionics so that it can handle the navigation challenges at the poles, which are considerable. Then you have some of the worst weather in the world. You have pilot fatigue issues on a larger scale. It's a totally different animal. And what we're asking of the plane is definitely taking it to its limits.
Now, obviously, you're not going to be using a compass to find either the South Pole or the North Pole. Talk about some of the challenges with GPS and how you're meeting those challenges.
Yeah, I've talked to some very experienced people that have flown the South Pole. One of them was one of the senior pilots for the British Antarctic Survey, because the British have a large presence down there. And he was talking about GPS systems, and he said that they could not calculate the actual pole. It's, where all the meridians come together. So what they would do is they would cheat the GPS and put a waypoint before the pole and after the pole, and then just skip the pole. Other people have said, hey, you need to have a DG, a directional gyro, because when you lose your navigation, you need to be able to steer a course until you regain it. Other people have said, hey, you need to take a line of position on the sun, and on your outbound leg, keep in mind it's at this position and then reverse it on the way back. What I've done, in addition to all those things, is I've changed out my avionics and gone with Avidyne, because they have a different coordinate system that will not lose the pole. And they've done numerous simulations and found that to work. So I'd like to say I'm hedging my bet in a number of ways, but very in tune with that challenge.
And I'm guessing some people are wondering, well, when you get to the South Pole, are you landing there? And I'm guessing you're not. Tell us what happens once you're there.
Well, once I'm at the South Pole, I'll probably do a course reversal and fly over it once or twice and then head directly back, because I'll definitely be concerned about fuel. We don't even know if the plane will climb the altitude and that distance on the outbound leg, because it's going to be so heavy. But yeah, I'm going to get there and get out of there as fast as I can, Max. The other consideration too is insurance, right? Think about an insurance company. Do they really want to insure something like this? So if I were to land, then that would include modifying the Turbine Commander with skis, and then it goes into the experimental category and hasn't been done before. So to keep the insurance at a reasonable rate and improve my chances for survival on that leg, it makes sense to overfly it. I will have the permits, though, that are required to fly over the South Pole, but contacting McMurdo and getting authorization to land, that just didn't make sense.
And I think most people would think polar circumnavigation means starting at one point and just keep going until you return back to the original point. In this case, you're actually kind of making a loop around the pole and coming back from where you started. Is that pretty traditional for polar circumnavigations?
Well, most of the people that I know that have done the circumnavigations over the poles, they're trying to set speed and distance records. And we will set a speed and distance record over the poles, and it's in the C1F category, according to the Fédération Aéronautique Internationale. But for me, since it's taken so long to prepare for this trip, the resources that are required are enormous. It makes sense to get the absolute most out of it. So I'm going to take my time. The other thing that it does is it allows the temperatures to change. So I'll be flying in November, December over the South Pole, which is their summer, and then it will take 6 months approximately for it to become summer at the North Pole. So it's going to be drawn out 5 or 6 months, and I'll stop along the way and lecture for different women in aviation groups, explorer clubs, AOPA affiliates, and United Nations Association groups. Basically, anybody who wants to hear about the trip, I'll share.
Now, you talked a little bit about some of the modifications to the airplane. Tell us what kind of airplane it is and how you chose that aircraft.
Sure, that's a great question. It is the Gulfstream version of the Turbine Commander, which is now owned by Twin Commander. But it's the 1983, the 900D model. And it's actually the most desired model. It's the fastest. They would later come out with the 1000 model. But what happened was when Gulfstream bought the plane from Rockwell, each of these companies improves the plane because they want it to be better, and they have sort of different technology that they can add to it. And I think when Gulfstream finally got to it, it was a decent plane, but they made it even better. They added one of their wings, which was 10 feet longer, which, by the way, had winglets back in 1983. Eventually, the plane would be upgraded with a Dash 10 Honeywell engine, which allowed it to fly higher and faster. The compression or the pressurization inside the plane was increased, and the pressurization went out to the skin of the plane, not the floorboard, so it became more spacious. So if you put all these things together, including the props that I mentioned earlier, you have a long, very efficient wing, you have very efficient propellers with all the technology that's available today, Honeywell did a remarkable job on these Dash 10 engines because it cruised the other day at 35,000 feet. I was burning 25.6 gallons per side. And if you compare that to a Pilatus PC-12 that's putting out the same amount of horsepower, they're burning more than double that. So you have efficient engines, efficient props, efficient wing, lots of space inside the cabin of the plane, and you have the ability to fly at 35,000 feet. You add a ceramic coating, you change out the environmental system to one made by a guy named Peter Schiff that uses less bleed air. And now we're doing 318 knots true, whereas before we were doing like 290. So you put all these things together, and I believe it's then possible to make a leg that long. Now, some people have done it in smaller planes, and they have skis on them and pre-position fuel. But, can you imagine how much it costs to pre-position fuel in Antarctica? And the challenges of that, right?
Yeah, indeed. That's a lot of money. So how many hours do you think you'll be flying for your longest leg?
The longest leg should be somewhere between 17 and 18 hours. The challenge, though, is really knowing what the performance characteristics are of the plane in its modified configuration with the ferry tanks. So we'll have an extra 985 gallons of fuel, but who really knows how fast it will climb and how efficiently it will, fly at altitude? What's the angle of attack going to be? Is the wing going to be struggling to just keep the plane in the air, or am I going to be scooting along? And we're going to do some test flights over the United States. And I've elicited the help of a gentleman who used to be the president of the Experimental Test Pilots Association. And he told me after this flight that I could qualify as being a test pilot. But my hope is that we're going to be able to do some test flights and really nail down what the performance of the plane will be.
Well, I'm just thinking about fatigue. The Solar Impulse pilots flew long distances around the world, and they would take naps. What's your strategy for napping and staying wide awake along the long leg?
Yeah, that's a great point. I spoke actually with Bertrand Piccard at the Living Legends of Aviation event for about an hour, and we talked about that. My intention is to have the option of taking some micro naps while I'm in autopilot, flying on that leg. But the last person that I talked to who flew that, I asked him if he ever slept, and he said no. And I said, well, why not? Wouldn't it make sense to try and refresh yourself? And he goes, Robert, I was afraid the entire time. The thought of sleeping didn't even cross my mind.
When we talked over lunch recently, you were telling me about a gentleman named Fred who's a ferry pilot, and he talked about fear, and he still fears each trip. Tell us a little bit about Fred, how he's helped you, and what he ends up, having to do prior to his long overwater trips.
Yeah, Fred Sorenson, one of the highest time ferry pilots in the world. He has over 500 Pacific crossings. And this guy is a legend. I mean, I joke with him that he's a god. He's got a great sense of humor. But, one of the challenges I had was sleeping the night before these open ocean legs on my 2015 trip. And I would wake up in the middle of the night in a, sweat. My inner child was yelling at me, screaming at me, cussing at me, why are you making me do this? And when I finished the trip, I was back in Las Vegas, and there was a few of us in the hangar pulling the ferry tanks out. And, when Fred talks, you just sort of stop what you're doing and listen. And he was working on the forward fuel compartment, disconnecting some of the fuel lines, and there were two of his helpers. And I explained to him what had happened. And I said, hey, Fred, how do you deal with that stress? And as soon as I said that, the hangar just went quiet. And everybody was like hanging on the edge of their seat. And he stops, and you can see he's thinking, kind of looks up in the air and goes, Robert, before I do an open ocean crossing, I always vomit the night before and the morning of, and then I'm fine. And then he just went back to work. And, we're all standing there with our mouths open thinking, wow, this guy with more experience than all of us combined was more afraid than I was.
Yeah, so it tells you, even with all that experience, the fear doesn't go away.
No, it doesn't. And it's really about how you deal with it, internally. So, yeah, that was a very interesting moment to me. And I consider Fred a bit of a mentor. And I'm not just talking about flying. I mean, this guy is teaching me lessons about life every time he communicates with me.
Well, obviously, you've had a large support team that you've assembled to kind of coach yourself through the entire process here. Tell us a little bit about the team you've assembled for this next trip.
Yeah, I have an amazing team, and I'm very, very fortunate. It's really funny because I was out at Catalina Island this past weekend, and I had a challenging departure because I had one of my ATAHRs, the Attitude Heading and Reference System, fail on the takeoff roll, and I was a little concerned about what speed I was actually rotating. So anyway, I was thinking about that the entire time I was at Catalina, and just when I was getting ready to take off again, up walked Mike Jesh, who's a commercial airline pilot with over 20,000 hours of experience. He lectures for AOPA. He's the guy that's going to help me make the go, no-go decision in Antarctica, and he's helping me compose some of the climb data that we're looking for. And, he reminded me, hey, did you look at your steam gauge on the, to the left of that, or go all the way over to the right? Did you have that bandwidth? And it was just an amazing synchronicity that he just happened to be there when I needed him, right? What's the probability of that? So we have Mike, Susan Gilbert, a wonderful lady, one of my mentors. She's helped me with my books. She helped me when I was in Malaysia with my last plane when the engine had failed. She's my number one. She's my tactician. She guides me. She's an amazing woman, and I've dedicated my books to her. There's a lady named Mary Mark Dante. She's also one of my mentors. She's an editor of mine, very spiritual lady. Her and Susan together, I think, give me more guidance, at the absolute moments that I need it. Together, they're awesome, and they are my lifetime supporters as well. There's a guy named Tim Nealon who works for CAPS, Corporate Airports, who does a lot of my survival training. Actually, he does 99% of my survival training. Just a wealth of information. He's the guy who took the survival bag that I had put together for some AOPA articles and basically threw it out. And we started over, and we came up with something much, much better that took into consideration, conservation of energy, space. A lot of my stuff had expired and I had missed it. Just an awesome guy. The other one is a guy named Ron Holnick. He was one of my instructors for my advanced graduate degree in spiritual psychology, and he is my world peace advisor. He was the guy that I went to during my first trip, and I said, Ron, I'm looking for a cause to sort of tie to this. And he looked at me and said, how about world peace? And we both laughed at the time, and I thought he was kind of joking. So it wasn't until the second trip when my bandwidth, where I had more bandwidth to think about something that big, that we took on that mission. But he's definitely a spiritual guide and somebody I've drawn on at key moments. And then the other person is a guy named Brian Keating. He's a professor of astrophysics at UCSD. And he's the guy who told me the day that I needed to cross the South Pole. He's talked to me about magnetic and true north and south. He's a pilot as well, and a very good friend and supporter. So I'm blessed to have, this team of people.
Well, in addition to having a good team to coach you along, you also have sponsors that are help footing part of the bill. Tell us about your sponsors and how you found them.
Yeah, sponsorship is something I could talk to you about, Max, for probably hours, if not days. It's one of those places that I had to go outside my comfort zone. And after 4 or 5 years of doing this and building the relationships, I'm happy to say that we have 85 sponsors. And, these people are people that believe in me, believe in the mission, believe in the things that we're trying to do out in the world. And they back me with their products. They back me with cash sometimes. And maybe the most important thing is when I call them and have a question, they're there for me. They're an amazing group of people. And we carried over, I'd say, 85% of our sponsors from the first trip. So these are people I've known for a while. And when I went to Oshkosh just a few months ago, for me, it's fun to go back and visit with them and get them up to speed and talk about what they're working on. MT Propeller, for example, built me these custom 5-bladed nickel tip props that had never been put on a Commander before. And some of the people in the industry that were engineers and in the know said they would never work. And MT seemed to think differently. And they had, of course, provided me with a prop for that first trip, 4-bladed one. And now these 5-bladed props are sold out for the next 6 months, and everybody loves them and is trying to get them on their planes. So, having access to really, really smart people is a very cool thing. And I was talking to them about some of their 9-bladed props. So let me just say, there are more blades ahead.
You can't have too many blades. That's funny. So tell us about some of the fundraising aspects of both your books and about the trip.
Yeah, thank you for asking that question. Most people think that I'm probably making a fortune on this trip with all this support. The truth of the matter is that we have a foundation, and the profits from our books, the coloring books, commemorative coins, compression socks, eventually flags that we're working on now, and some of our DVDs, the upcoming book called The Little Plane That Could. All the profits for that go to support the trip. But at the point the trip is completed, then they all go to fund scholarships for kids. And I haven't taken a salary from the foundation since we started it, and I don't intend to. It's really about what we can do in the world using aviation, because a lot of people, relate to aviation. They dream of flying. They use expressions that draw on aviation, like I'm on autopilot, or, I'm coming in for a 3-point landing, or whatever the expression is. So it's something that's sort of near and dear to everybody's heart. And we really just want to leverage that and do the most good we can in the world.
Yeah, I think that's something all of us think about, especially as we get older. I think, in the early days, we're probably thinking more about building our career, but certainly as we get later in life, think about what we can do to make the world a better place after we're gone. Tell me about some of the specific recipients of the funds that you'll be raising.
Well, the goal is to inspire young kids. And what I haven't shared, Max, with many people is that Redbird is stepping up to the plate, and we're going to do 5 simulations of the pole-to-pole flight. And I'm actually working on writing those now. And they will work on 3,500 Redbird simulators that you'll be able to find at any given time across the planet. A lot of them are in schools like the McGavick High School in Tennessee. Other ones are in museums. And the plan is to take the plane and use it as a mobile STEM lab after the trip. And I'll fly around to Young Eagle events, different airports, like the Smithsonian wants me to do a lecture and bring the plane. And we'll have the simulators so the kids can hop on the simulators, fly some of the challenging parts that could potentially happen, touch the plane, go in the plane, see the absolute best video game ever. It'll, trump their home computer 10 times over, and really feel, what that experience was about. And I joke with some of the people at Redbird that these simulations are going to be so intense, we'll need to have a psychologist standing right next to them to help them after they get off the simulator. But, we're not holding anything back. We're going to give them everything. So, yeah, the foundation supports some great causes, and we need to do something that's notable to get their attention. And, we reach out to them oftentimes on social media. I've been criticized a little bit, Max, because people say we're too out there. But this is where the kids are, and that's where we need to be to really reach them. So we're going to do what it takes.
And on your website, you talk both about AOPA scholarship program and also an elementary school in San Diego. Tell us about that.
Yeah, that was for the 2015 trip, the Lindbergh Schweitzer School. And we invited 2 of their 4th grade classrooms over to the airport. At the time, it was Landmark. Now it's Signature. And I did a presentation for them. They got to wear the immersion suit that I wear on some of the open ocean legs. And, they were little kids, so they wanted to touch the plane. And as a pilot, I'm sure you can understand that nobody really wants anybody touching their plane that they're going to, take into the air on a long trip. But I knew it was really important they get to touch it. So we all lined up along the leading edge of the wing. And at the same moment in time, we all touched the plane. And that was a magical moment. And I'll never forget that. We actually have some video of that. And they got excited. And that we want to do more of that. We want to bring it to them and make it so intriguing that they want to pursue some related field in aviation, or at least ignite them, their interests and things that maybe they thought weren't possible.
And I read somewhere that Eric Lindbergh is going to accompany you on part of the trip.
Yeah, that's the plan. What we want to do is on the final or penultimate leg of the trip, fly back into San Diego International with him. And that'll be, at the height of our notoriety. And he, of course, is a strong supporter of aviation. He's got a company called Vertigo, and they're developing an electric plane, and he's very much interested in inspiring kids. And I actually walk most days in Balboa Park, which is where his grandfather, Charles Lindbergh, used to walk. So I feel connected to him, his grandfather, and we're in alignment in terms of what we want to do for aviation. And I realize that, at some point in the future, we're going to be flying electric planes. I'm not sure we're there yet, but I'd like to do some sort of handoff to either him or that whole community of people that are working toward that goal.
Yeah, I agree. I think electric airplanes are our future and they're going to have a lot of huge benefits. One thing about technology that's been kind of on everybody's mind has been ADS-B. Talk a little bit about how that's going to be involved with your Citizen of the World flight.
Right. Automatic dependent surveillance broadcast. And we've all heard that there's a mandate January 1st, 2020, all general aviation planes are supposed to have it. What I've sort of learned in this process is there's a thing called diversity. And I just wrote an article for my AOPA blog on diversity. It basically is taking that ADS-B system and adding an antenna on top of the plane. Most planes will have the antennas on the bottom. But what that allows me to do is be tracked globally during the circumnavigation using this ADS-B out technology. And Iridium just put 66 new Next satellites into orbit. So the satellites are able to track the plane. There's a company called Aviation that deals with the raw data, and then eventually it makes it flight aware. And what we're hoping to do is be able to track the plane real time. Now there's some challenges. It's being done, but reporting that to all the people out in the world via flight aware is where we're, dealing with our challenge now. But the plane is now equipped, and I think that's going to replace a lot of the ground-based equipment that's so expensive and really help to bring aviation to many different countries. And then, of course, they can use a lot of that data to plan out more efficient flight paths. Carbon signature is less. It really is the future of aviation.
Give us your target date. I know it shifts and you'll obviously go when you're ready to go, but when do you think you're going to be departing now?
I believe we'll be departing November 16th, and I've certainly delayed the trip, but all the major things that were in front of us have been dealt with, and now we're just fine-tuning. So I'm pretty confident November 16th is going to be a pretty good day, unless we have something that happens with the plane, but I feel like we've worked a lot of the bugs out of it. So yeah, November 16th.
And how will people be able to track you?
Well, probably the best way is on social media. And of course, we're on Twitter, YouTube, Instagram, Pinterest, Facebook. We also have a website. It's www.pole2poleflight.com, which is a great way to track us. So lots of opportunities.
Well, as we start to wrap up here, any final advice for people and pilots about dreaming big and living their lives?
I would say that every pilot is really an ambassador, whether they want to be or not. People look up to them. People see them out in the world. And if they're dreaming big, then other people can see them as the example. A lot of times people see these big challenges as insurmountable, but realistically, taking a little bit at a time, doing a little bit every day, eventually you're going to get there. It doesn't matter how big your project is. So I don't think there's any harm in going after some of these big challenges. The absolute worst case scenario is that you don't achieve what you set out, but you learned a lot of things along the way. You probably inspired a few people. And for the next person who's going to take on the challenge, it makes it that much easier for them.
Yeah, good advice for just about anything people want to tackle. The books are Flying Through Life and Zen Pilot, Flights of Passion and the Journey Within. Robert, thanks so much for talking with us here today.
Max, thanks for having me on. It's always a pleasure.
Well, Robert is certainly dreaming big, and I hope he inspires you to dream just a little bit bigger. Now, for some of you, that might mean getting your private pilot certificate, or perhaps getting your dream job in aviation, or maybe for some of you, it might just mean flying yourself around the world. If you'd like a little more inspiration, you might want to pick up a copy of Robert's books, Zen Pilot, Flight of Passion and the Journey Within, which describes his first around-the-world flight, and Flying Through Life. You'll find links in our show notes for both of Robert's books, and if you click on them, it will take you to Amazon where you can order them. And when you use those links in our show notes to order, I'll earn a small advertising fee from Amazon, for which I thank you. You'll also find links in the show notes to Robert's Pole-to-Pole website, where you can learn more about his upcoming trip and track the flight after he takes off. You'll also find links in the show notes for following Robert on social media. To get to the show notes and all of these links and more, in the Apple Podcast app or in our dedicated Aviation News Talk apps for iOS and Android, just swipe up on your phone while you're listening to this show. Or on the web, go to aviationnewstalk.com. And don't forget to tell your friends about the show, because that's how we get most of our new listeners. When people like you tell their friends about the Aviation News Talk podcast. And I know some of them don't know what a podcast is, and if that's the case, just send them out to the Apple App Store or the Google Play Store, where they can download our dedicated Aviation News Talk podcast apps for iOS and Android. In the App Store, just search for Aviation News Talk. And yes, those apps are free. So until next time, fly safely, have fun, and keep the blue side up.